And welcome to Milestone 11. This will be an overview of the previous milestones, since now we have a completed project to demonstrate. So the heartbeat of this project was to develop a flood prediction model, which I did using the dataset that records back to 1956 flooding in Bangladesh. And Bangladesh is a notable area to study flooding with, not only because the data set itself was so very complete, but because the nation itself has the world's largest collection of rivers, as well as, of course, mangrove forests, and it has relatively low-lying area. So this was one of the initial sites that Google themselves started to develop their closed system or black box flood prediction with. So my project was to create or to start an open source flood prediction service through the support of SingularityNET, DeepFunding, and the voting community. So along with this, we built simulations of flooding scenarios, both with levels of water and with physical water fluid simulations. The fluid simulations need to take place within a constricted area because of the complexity in a real-time system compared to, say, full scientific modeling that will be accurate but lack the real-time. And the purpose of this is ultimately to demonstrate the effects of flood mitigation structures and to provide an opportunity for citizen and perhaps first responder training as well within a virtual simulation. So we'll start the riverside flood. I have flood emitters underneath the water here. And you can see that they will start to impact on different flood mitigation measures. Now, over here, we have an empty field over which the floodwaters move unrestricted. An example of a levee, which is blocking the floodwaters to a degree, you can see there. Over here, we have groins. I grew up near ocean water, so I'm very familiar with these structures. They're at an angle, waterside or riverside in this case, to try and redirect water from flooding. And a groin, which is basically just a mound of dirt meant to block or reduce floodwaters. Now, in comparison to the unplanted area, where water is flowing freely, we have the planted area, which tends to break up and slow down water. And give it time to soak into the ground. Okay. And we can see, of course, that the fluid simulation is showing water going around objects like rocks and trees and so on. So if we go over here, there's also a storm drain, which is sadly overwhelmed. But you can see a fluid simulation of how the water is spinning around the drain as it drops into the system. Okay, so I'll stop that simulation. Now, we created an endpoint and an API thanks to O'Neill Mbakwe and Kamini Kibutu, who very professionally produced both the modeling service, the model itself, trained it on the data set that I'd researched and suggested, and they produce and upkeep the API as well. So I will send a request for flood conditions to the server, as you can see down here, and the results will show up over here. So in the meantime, while that process takes place, I will show you the different flooding levels. Well, firstly, I'll show you the crowd simulation. Part of this project was to populate the environment so that we just didn't have a bare movie set kind of model. So in that case, there are colliders set up. So when you go from one section of town to another, different groups of people will appear. And we're currently in the section that shows a long sidewalk and a short sidewalk, individual groups of people. So what I've set up based on that was also an opportunity to interact with individuals. This person I wanted to design as someone who was suffering some mental confusion, possibly signs of dementia within a flood situation, because that creates a scenario for how do you de-escalate as a first responder or a citizen in that situation. So we'll approach her, and she will give us a bit of a speech.
Why isn't it being fixed? I have groceries to buy. I can't. can't walk my dog.
Now, after the initial speech is given, I have the opportunity to actually converse with her using a language model, ChatGPT in this case. I will ask her if she has family nearby.
I'm worried about my dog. She needs to go out, but what if my shoes get wet? I don't understand all this noise, the emergency vehicles. Why are they here? It's so confusing. I just wanted to take a walk. Can you help me find my coat?
Now, how this works is that I give the actor, in this case, the older lady who may be suffering from dementia or confusion, and I give them a role. I instruct them to focus a bit on repetition, to express a little bit of confusion. So over here, another person to interact with is going to be the first responder. These crowd simulations will reset in a moment as well. So
That man, he looks important. But why is he here? I want to walk my dog. I don't want my shoes to get wet. It's just so loud. Everything is loud. Do you think he knows where my coat is? It's hard to think with all this noise.
now what's interesting is as you go through and have these conversations, no two conversations will be exactly alike, but they will follow a theme. So the next step is to walk over to this gentleman. Creating the terrain was really interesting for this whole scenario. I could do an entire demonstration just on that.
Hi, I can take a few moments to talk with you. Like you can see, we're expecting a flood event here, enough to endanger people and property. A flood level of 3 feet is all that's needed to float cars. We're worried also about cascading risks like electrical and fire damage. Moment, yes, aha, okay, that sounds dangerous. Hi, flood surges incoming. I strongly suggest you find shelter at elevation.
Now, with both of these actors, I've set an initial speech that I pre-recorded so that I could lip sync it in an external package. But when we go to the conversation, that needs to take place in real time. So now I'll ask the first responder for advice in helping the lady who is exhibiting a mental distress. And I receive actually useful advice through the language model, which is really kind of cool.
We need to assist her. It's crucial to ensure her safety. Let's gently approach her, introduce ourselves, and explain the situation in simple terms. We'll reassure her that we're here to help and that it's important to leave the area. We can help her gather her belongings and guide her to safety. If she has a dog, we should check for any arrangements for pets. Keep an eye on her comfort level. We want to make this process as smooth as possible for her, given the confusion and stress of the situation. Let's proceed quickly but calmly.
So the first responder, again, I provided him with a role, a description of a situation to ChatGPT, and it's actually coming back with fairly useful generalized advice. So if I walk back over to the lady here, I have a frame limit on the amount of crowd simulation, so they'll be frozen here for a moment until it resets again. Okay.
Oh, thank you. I don't understand why it's so loud. My dog needs to go out, but what if my shoes get wet? I don't want to get my clothes soaked. It's all too much. Why can't I remember things? I feel so confused. Where's my coat?
So now, even with just this situation where we have two actors and two roles in LLMs, we begin to create a dynamic. A dynamic emerges between the two that is actually useful for instructing a citizen how to both coordinate with an authority on site during a flood situation and how to support and de-escalate someone who's experiencing confusion in such an event, which I think for me is a really positive outcome of this entire experiment. So let's go to the different regions of crowd simulation first. I'm doing these out of order because I'm just following a narrative of description rather than the actual milestones progress, because we'd started with the flood prediction model, and you can see the results up here have arrived, confirmed by the status down below. And in TechNav, Bangladesh, there's a low flood probability. Now I've tied these results into flood simulations, so we'll see some minor differences in particle flow when we go from one to another. So here we have a group milling outside of this restaurant, just to give the place a little bit of life. I've also set the picnic tables and a few other objects to float when flood levels rise further. On the other end of town, we have people that are gathered near the gas station. But let me go next to the flood levels themselves. So I wanted to arrange different scenarios of the depths of floodwaters, because those have a direct effect on whether there is reaction by first responders, or how that affects traffic, or how that affects people. And you can see the low level here is not really causing too much trouble. It's the kind of situation where it's a little bit dangerous, but we can still manage as individuals. I've also added a little bit of water distortion as you move through this as well. So I'll increase that to a medium flood. That will bring it up to more or less around waist level-ish. Yeah. And I have some physics on the objects themselves, which we'll see in a moment. I discovered during this, I added objects that will float in the simulation, like pylons, and over here, a shopping cart and a car. It turns out only 3 feet of water is needed to float a car. So I tried to simulate that here. Switch to high flood, which will be basically about neck level. And this is where it starts to, of course, become dangerous to life. We can see that the higher water level is now flooding these pylons and lighter objects, but also starting to affect the car. You can see it moving back and forth there, and the shopping cart. So catastrophic and extreme flood, of course, will do more. These will raise higher. You can assign, in a very simple way, just some basic weights to these objects. And the highest cyclone and flood, I also take one of these buildings off of its foundation across the street. So see if we can make our way through. Yeah, so this house, it's a little tricky to see, but you can see that it's come off of its foundation on the upper top part of the frame here. The idea that the house itself would be lifted up out of flood waters. So the other houses are still secured, to their foundations, but this one's been moved free or moved loose. Okay, so bring that back down to low flooding. And there's some basic physics simulation, so you can see the house is kind of returned back to ground level, but not necessarily on its moorings. And I've set an extreme level of zoom here so that we can get a clear view of what's happening. So we'll turn that off. Now, after creating the flood model, the next thing we did was create structures or represent structures that are built in human situations to mitigate the flooding. So we've already seen the riverside flood with groins and berms and planted areas. So let us go to storm and sewer. The idea here is that a partial barrier within the pipes will attempt to split stormwaters from residential effluent. The effluent being, of course, heavier than stormwater itself. The idea that most of it will be separated. The stormwater will go towards outflows and the residential effluent will go towards sewage processing instead. Now, this area would normally be underground and it would be surrounded by dirt. But I wanted to create a kind of instructional environment as well that we can begin to populate with displays and other examples of the kinds of infrastructure that are used to mitigate this sort of flooding. Doing the research for this was fascinating in its own right because a lot of thought goes into what happens underneath the ground. So we'll go over to this gas station. Now here we're showing a property drain, a public drain, and a stormwater detention. The idea being that the stormwater detention is basically a box structure that will try and collect as much stormwater as possible before redirecting it towards a public drain. And of course, any system can be overwhelmed. Something I would love to replicate is a Japanese system which have these huge vaults that's meant to capture tsunami level floodwaters. And these, of course, are just very minor in comparison. Now, I used a fluid simulation package from a very clever programmer who's Ukrainian called Zebra, which is able to pretty effectively create real-time particle simulations useful enough for demonstrating these kinds of structures. So let's go underneath the gas station so we can see what's actually being done here. There we go. The darn mouse. 50 years of computing and we're still playing Find the Mouse. Okay, so here we are underground, beneath the structure. You can see the property drain. The stormwater detention has a barrier on the top to help modulate the flow of water into the public storm drain. Now, in between, this area is where a pipe normally connects the two, and it's made invisible just for the purposes of our demonstration. So water is then cascading as before over the property drain into the detention structure, which has a barrier, and that's directing it towards the public drain for flood management. And I have a shader on this that kind of splits away part of the physical structure so we can see the actual structure itself. So this is fascinating, just to kind of see what's been developed over time to mitigate regular storm occurrences or heavy rainwater in this case. So now the bridge pathway. This one is meant to simulate the breaking of a natural dam, releasing floodwaters into a situation that isn't necessarily designed to handle it. And that was inspired by the unfortunate scenarios in North Carolina. Now here we can see the fluid simulation will start to move tree trunks. You can see one going there, a truck that it's overturned. And this simulation goes all the way down to the housing area. Okay. And I've tried to make the water muddy here as well. The crevice area underneath the bridge is filled with rocks and branches and tree stumps and so on. And the floodwaters themselves go all the way down to the street level we were just at. Okay. So I'll stop this simulation and then make my way down to the gas station so I can show you the other crowd simulation. Creating the terrain for this was interesting. I used a package called Microverse, and that allowed me to create a terrain in real time, but also add bridges and add areas where vegetation cover wasn't to exist, like on the pavement here. Okay. So the purpose of all of this is basically to create an experimental structure that's useful for demonstrating how floodwaters can be mitigated, but also how you can begin to interact with citizens. And here we have a little bit of a family discussion. More first responders working this area, and a few crowds of individuals standing around talking. So what else? Oh yes, there's still one more thing to show you, which is a collapse event. And to do that, I have to go all the way over to the other side of town here. So just get a little bit of jogging in. Now, the idea of this was to show how a large and immobile structure might collapse within an extreme flood situation. And the premise I was going for was to suggest perhaps that there was a sinkhole. Oh, and that's going to come crashing down any moment. That there was a sinkhole underneath this actual area. And this is based on my direct experience. In that there's a small area of land connecting the province I grew up in, Nova Scotia, with the next province over called New Brunswick. And it was discovered that flooding is becoming more and more frequent in this area of Amherst and Oxford, as they're called, two main cities. And it was also discovered that under Oxford, there are actual sinkholes. So I got to thinking, okay, if the ground was saturated enough with water, and there were some infirmities in the ground, like a sinkhole, what would happen to a large physical structure like this? So I added a collapse event. And this is meant to play out automatically, just to reduce the amount of work that a real-time engine needs to create. So not a bad start to extreme situations. So I'll just reset all of that. And there you have it. I think that brings to a conclusion the demonstration of our project. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you, SingularityNET and DeepFunding, especially for this funding, which allowed me to bring the model training and model into actuality, but also to create this virtual environment through which instruction can take place. So all my best. I hope for further successes in the future, because it is a real shame to have to say goodbye to this kind of work. But everything that has an ending, or everything that has a beginning, has an ending. Take care, and that's Milestone 11, and I will see you.